Hi, everyone. Welcome all to our first Citizen Lab webinar here in the US. My name is Ben, and I work with Citizen Lab. We are a digital democracy and community engagement platform working with half a dozen cities here in the US and over 200 cities around the world. In the past year, participatory budgeting, or PB as we'll probably call it today, has become one of the most popular uses of our platform. But with this rise in popularity, we've also seen a rise in questions and misconceptions about what's actually needed to set one up. So we wanted to challenge some of those narratives and do so by taking a look at a series of exciting and innovative PB projects that work primarily with youth and students, many of whom aren't of voting age and within public schools. And so joining us today, we have Thea Crum from the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Drew Brown, a PB expert and consultant with EduSay Consulting. They'll each share a bit about their work, why there's such enthusiasm for PB in schools, and help you think about what's required to launch PB in your own communities. So Drew, Thea, who wants to go first and introduce yourself?
I think that finger is pointing at me. Welcome, everybody. Excited to be here with all of you this morning, this evening, this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Thea Crum. I work at the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I have been working with participatory budgeting since 2012 here in Chicago, and it has been so many things. It's been a great joy, and it's also had so many challenges and so many fun innovations and experimentation. So I look forward to sharing that with you. We currently are working with both elected officials in wards across the city of Chicago, and we are working in, now we're up to 16 schools, public schools across the city of Chicago as well, where we work both in classroom with teachers, as well as in student councils to do PB, where youth are both creating the proposals that go on the ballot and then voting to decide which projects to fund. Drew.
Good afternoon, evening, morning to those that are joining us today. My name is, I currently am consulting around community development, education, public health, and in particular participatory budgeting. I studied participatory budgeting as a doctoral student at Arizona State University and was part of the first rollout of school participatory budgeting in the United States across the school district, which is the Phoenix Union High School District, which formed the basis for my dissertation. Most recently, the consulting firm that I'm a part of, we implemented participatory budgeting for a food coalition in the interests of food equity here in rural Southwest Colorado. I'm coming to you from Pagosa Springs, the world's deepest hot springs. It's important for you to know that. So thank you for having me here today, and I hope that I can be of some use to you all.
Great, great. Well, thank you both for joining us. So let's get right into it. And again, for those that have just joined, we will do Q&A towards the end of the hour. So if you have questions, please write them in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them at the end. All right, so let's get started. So I think the first question for you both, and I think one that's kind of at the top of everyone's mind, is why work with youth? Who wants to go first?
I'd say probably youth brought me to this specialty. So it's a question I think I answered before PB. I'm going to try to re-answer it now in the context of PB. Young people, I mean, even our society's sort of approach to youth is a bit troubling, right? We ask, like, when does adulthood begin? And I think biology has kind of chimed in on that one, but we don't teach like how to be an adult or how to be a parent or a partner in school. And we don't really teach how to be a citizen either, a member of a community. And Benjamin Franklin actually said that one of the reasons that we needed to have school was because we had to teach people what it was to be an American, because no one had ever been one before. And although some of the overtones and undertones of that statement may be troubling in the current discourse, I think the idea that schools exist to help people develop the ability to participate in a healthy democratic process is a very important one to keep in mind. And youth are ready to do that. They see the things that are troubling to people younger than them, their age and older than them. They interact with parts of the physical and social reality that older people and younger people have not been engaging with. So they see problems that maybe others don't see because they walk places instead of driving cars, for example. And they need opportunities to really test their maturity and their insight and their intellectual capacity. And I think working with youth can be one of the most rewarding experiences anyone can have.
And I guess what would you say, Taya, before you jump in, I guess what would you say to someone who would say, you know, will students take this seriously? Do they, are they too young? Like, how have you seen, you know, working with, when you say youth, do you mean kind of seniors in high school, or, you know, how young have you seen PB go, and how does that change when working with younger students?
I mean, I think there's been a lot of work done with PB in elementary schools, for example, so it's not necessarily limited to secondary school students. However, I do believe that that threshold of maturity is a really important developmental point for young people. I would say that, you know, one thing that I was looking for was how does the way like a teacher and the adults on a campus, the way that they talk about and refer to students, how does that change? You know, does it change over the course of the process? Do they continue to refer to them as children and kiddos, or do they start seeing them as young men and women in some way? So they're going to respond in many ways to how you seem to view them. But also, you know, it's scary. It's scary being accountable and responsible. You know, you keep asking, like, you know, put me in, coach. I want to make my own decisions. I want to choose. I want to choose. And then someone gives you the opportunity, and you're like, I don't know. It's kind of easier when you were choosing, and I could just disagree with you. So it all depends on what you see in them and kind of opportunities you provide, and helping nurture their acceptance of mistakes, you know, and how they celebrate their successes.
Yeah. Taya, what are you want to talk about your experience working with youth, and why, yeah, kind of why your work centers a lot around them?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with 100% with everything that Drew said, and you're very articulate. I think for us, again, it's, you know, we think a lot and talk a lot about how are we thinking about democracy and approaching democracy, both from a standpoint of changing culture, and thinking about how are we bringing more democratic systems, more opportunities for participation to all different kinds of members of the community, because youth are members of the community. And so they have a stake in their community, and their voices should be heard. And they should have a role in deciding what happens in that community. I think, to Drew's point, you know, when you think about, you know, their participation, you know, especially they're seeing that community through different eyes. And so, you know, when you're designing a park, you're not designing it necessarily for the adults who are watching the children play, who are making sure that they're not getting hurt. the children are the ones who are playing, right? And the teenagers are the ones who are using the parks in a different way. So if they're not involved in helping to think about how that park is being used, is it really the best park? Right? So that's kind of how we think about it and approach it too, is that these are all members of the community who are then giving you information about how to make some of these best decisions. In addition to, how are you building skills so that people can participate fully in society and in their communities? Some of what we've learned by doing this work in schools through our evaluation is that by participating in PB, students are gaining communication skills. They're gaining skills in how to collaborate with each other. They're gaining a sense of self-efficacy in believing that they can make a change, right? These are really important things. I think also, you know, when we think about the age, we are working with both elementary schools and high schools right now. And we've been, you know, I think approaching it from the standpoint of a developmental lens too. So, you know, how are you designing PB and thinking about PB and working with the teachers so that it makes sense to the youth, and you're helping them think about, you know, ways that they can participate and contribute, where you're not you know, asking them the same way you would maybe ask a 40-year-old when they're, you know, 10 years old, but still in a way where they're contributing meaningfully and talking about it and understanding you know, what's being, you know, what's being asked of them in terms of their ideas around school improvement. And that may take a little bit more time, but I think it's worth it, because they, again, are the ones who are using that school, right? And so you uncover things. I'll give an example from a high school. We had a high school where after gym class, students were chronically late. They were late all the time. And so, but nobody asked why. They were just handing out detentions, and students were getting into trouble. And then, right there, it was creating all this tension in the school. We did a PB process, and one of the things that they asked for were shower curtains. There were no shower curtains. And so the students were chronically late after gym class because they didn't want to take showers in front of each other. And so we were able to fund shower curtains, and then the students weren't late after class anymore. So sometimes you uncover things through these processes that, you know, just by having conversations with each other, that you wouldn't normally know or understand about different members of your community.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example. And I think maybe, you know, I know we've got a lot of people on here who have or know PB, you know, kind of maybe as well as you both do. But I think we also have some people who are relatively new to PB. So I guess before we go a little bit further, because I want to get into the process, so maybe a good way to get there would be to, do you want to talk a bit about, you know, in Chicago and in Arizona and Colorado, do you want to talk a bit about what the process of these past projects have looked like, and kind of how you determine and how you think about kind of what makes a successful process or project?
Well, I just wanted to actually build on a couple of things that Thea said just while we're there.
Go for it.
I think the last thing that you said is huge, right? And probably from the standpoint of schools, you know, anyone that's going to be hosting PB, it opens institutional ears, right? Because I'm sure that those students talked about those shower curtains for years, right? But finally, because of PB, there was, you know, someone could finally hear what was going on, and they were interested in coming up with a solution. And often I think that happens in our society, where there's this veil between those that can make, you know, execute decisions and those that need things changed. And, you know, teachers aren't always able to respond to it. They can hand out detention slips and that's about it. The other was, the interest in changing culture. And I do think that education for democratic citizenship does raise a very clear question that maybe we're a little afraid of, which is that at the end of the day, schools and education are about social conditioning. Maybe they're not about assimilation or brainwashing or, complete indoctrination, but they are a way that we kind of pull people towards a similar understanding. And participatory budgeting is pretty frank and open about that. But there's a goal here that we're trying to help people be better, democratic citizens. And then I think the other thing is when you look at the difference maybe between elementary school processes and high school processes, there's still an open question about doing school PB, at the high school level. On the one hand, you can have it done with student governments, and they're dealing with budgets that are related to student issues. But there's always a question around like voter eligibility. So who gets to vote? And I think this leads sort of into your next question. Well, if you decide that teachers can vote, what does that mean? Can administrators vote? Do parents get a vote? So then what's on the table? And I think one thing that Citizen Lab would be keenly concerned with, and one thing that it cares about is how does it help facilitate deliberation and democratic processes that differ in character and kind?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good point, and one that we do think about a lot, right? And so, if you think about a PV process, right, I think the obvious pieces of it are that you're asking a community to decide how to spend a set pot of money, right? And so, I think what is kind of lost in that description is all the work it takes to come up with those ideas, to discuss those ideas, and to assign pricing to those ideas, and then to actually pick those ideas. And so I think this is a good segue to kind of our next question here. I think so. What's lost is all of that deliberation, that back and forth. That by thinking about what how to actually build a budget, you're really having a conversation about values, and you're really having a conversation about priorities. And so this is Drew, Thea, this is questions for both of you. But can you talk more about kind of the PB processes in your communities, and kind of the educational experience that kind of undergirds the whole process? Maybe Thea, we'll start with you. How have you kind of seen it spread across Chicago, and you just want to talk a little bit about kind of what it's looked like there over the last couple of years, and maybe where you're going with it?
Sure. So I think I can talk a little bit. I'll talk about the spread, and then maybe Drew, I don't know if you want to talk more about the process, or I don't know. I guess we'll just flow. So in Chicago was the first place that PB ever happened in the United States. So in 2009, there was one ward, the 49th ward, in which an alderman experimented with giving $1 million to his residents to decide how to spend. From there, we came in 2012 and partnered with a national nonprofit called the Participatory Budgeting Project to really think about how do we expand it beyond one ward. Chicago has 50 wards, which are like, for those who aren't familiar with the ward structure, it's like a district, and they're city council members. And so we began spreading it across the city of Chicago in wards, and we're always really interested in terms of how youth participate. Part of that process included what we call a writing of the rules, which gets into process design to some extent, because what we decided with all of the participating wards, along with some support organizations who dealt with across the city issues like public transit or public parks, things along that nature, because the money that we use in the wards is tied to public infrastructure and can only be used for that. And so that was part of the decision around that. Really included things like what were the overarching goals that we wanted to accomplish citywide. And so we set those goals to include equity, inclusion, coalition and community building, and sustainability. And then, and this writing the rules process included every ward that was participating. It included residents. It included community organizing groups. It included community-based organizations. There was over 100 people who I think participated in the first Writing the Rules workshop. It also includes things like what's the timeline for each phase of the process. And so in Chicago, we follow a model that is followed pretty closely. There's a lot of variation in how each of these phases roll out. But the basic phases include idea collection, which is where residents in Chicago, and again, this is part of the Writing the Rules process, you decide who can contribute ideas. And so in Chicago, anyone can contribute an idea. And you also decide how those ideas can be contributed, whether they have to be submitted, online, in person. Some of those things they're all discussed as a part of this kind of larger rule book process. The next phase in the process is proposal development. And that's where all of those ideas are narrowed down. They're looked at from the standpoint of feasibility. Can you actually implement that idea with the amount of money you have? Is it allowable with the pot of money you're using according to the rules and regulations of that pot of money? Questions like that. And then they start being divided usually amongst categories. Those categories aren't usually set at Writing the Rules process. So I'm kind of mixing things here a little bit. But it's also, you set who is actually writing those proposals at the Writing the Rules. So in Chicago, it was decided that anyone who lived in a ward, went to school in a ward, worked there, owned a business, had a child who went to school there. So pretty broad in terms of the groups of stakeholders. And then you also set rules around voting. So what's the age threshold? Usually it's like you have to be this age or above. In Chicago, it's 14 years of age or older. And then what type of proof of, voting eligibilities. In some places around the world, there's no proof, and there's no voting age. They use like an online platform. You log in using your email address and you vote. In Chicago, you have to live in the ward and be 14 years of age or older. And there's a whole list of things in terms of eligibility that you can provide. So that was all determined at a Writing the Rules meeting. And then each ward also sets its own kind of internal goals in terms of what they'd like to accomplish each year. Involvement of youth was always a critical piece, which is why the voting age is so low. So we started out by really kind of trying to form youth committees where it was a subset of the population, where we really tried to create safe spaces for youth within the ward processes, with facilitators who were used to working with youth and would help make them feel comfortable. But it was challenging in Chicago because the meetings were held late at night, and most of the youth in Chicago are also taking care of their siblings, or they're having to take buses to other parts of the city late at night, and it just wasn't really effective. So we started looking at other ways to do it, and that's kind of where the school-based PB processes started to come into play, and how we started expanding there, where we started by working with an after-school program, first to do kind of a youth committee, and then that kind of grew into the first school-based process. And then from there, we partnered with the Chicago Chicago Public Schools system, and have been working to build it inside of the curriculum, as well as to develop other models. And our goal is to institutionalize it within the Chicago public school system within the next 3 to 5 years, and to expand to over 500 high schools and of 20% of the elementary schools.
Wow. I mean, it's
It was a lot of information. I'm sorry.
No. That's the complicated question. I think that's really great. And it's congratulations on being able to kind of grow something like this. So almost in a peer-to-peer fashion, school by school by school. And I think that's, yeah, I think it's really cool to see that it grow across the city like that. Drew, do you want to take a crack at this question? You want to talk a bit about kind of your experience and the kind of how the process and how it might differ? I think one thing that's also important to know is, and Thea, you were kind of alluding to it, is how localized each PB process can be, right? And how it's written by the community, it's implemented by the community. There's often times there can be city support, but it's really a community-led process. And so, Drew, what might also be interesting to highlight is you've worked both in cities and also in smaller communities as well. And so, to talk about how you've seen those experiences and the processes differ based on where they're implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I think Thea's description should give a glimpse into how iterative it is to work with PB. That there are many kind of starting points, and where you go from there can change a lot. I think in addition to the processes I've evaluated or implemented, I also had to study all of the ones since 1989, more or less. And it's really fascinating how differently things come about, how people define different terms like youth, who gets to participate in those definitions. The two processes that I've been most intimately involved with actually were far maybe less formal at first. It was sort of a let's get the ball rolling and figure it out as we go along. So in Phoenix, a school, one of the magnet schools in this high school district, the principal decided to give a little money and let them do PB 1 year. And that was in 2014. 2 years later, the district decided to pilot the process in 4 of its schools. It then expanded it to 8, and now it's throughout the district. So just as a little background, the Phoenix Union High School District stretches across municipal boundaries. So it's not just in Phoenix. It consists of 20 schools of over 28,000 students. And it's just high schools. So in all of the ways that, the process in Chicago related to the structure of wards, and then looking at, youth from those wards participating, and then the barriers to their participation, and then going into schools, for PB to expand in the Phoenix area, you were going to have to move from a school to a municipality, and you didn't have a direct line. It wasn't, oh, well, the Phoenix schools will go to the city of Phoenix. It could happen in a number of ways. Here in where I currently live, where we worked with a local food coalition, we also did a sort of development of the rule book. And that rule book was really, really flawed. There were a lot of times that we had to bring the steering committee back to discuss how that would work. And one of the major ones was eligibility. So originally eligibility was supposed to be, either over the age of 14 or a high school student of someone that lived in the county, worked in the county, or had a child that went to school in the county. Well, here in Southwest Colorado, our county is adjacent to 2 tribal nations. Not to mention it has relationships with other tribal nations that are very nearby. And so one of the questions that came up towards the end, one of the proposal developers wanted to know if the grandparents of some of the youth could vote. And they all lived, on tribal land. They didn't live in the county. And the point was brought up that, the kinship ties of family, grandparents, aunts, and uncles were as much caregivers as parents, sometimes more so. And so all of the idea of like, oh, do you have a child that attends school in the county changed. It changed when you went across borders, and we had to have a large discussion about how process design was going to work in that case. And there are different priorities in cities and small towns like the one that I worked in. So it's always about reading the landscape first, and that's a really important first step, as well as finding that advocate. So the alderman in Chicago, the principal in Phoenix Union, the Food Coalition, where I am.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's a really good point, especially about finding the advocate as well. When we both were speaking, we got a few questions that's speaking to the kind of how to set up your first PB process, or kind of how to get started, especially if you're working maybe in a school, maybe in the broader community, or with a local government. And so this might be a good time to switch to kind of our next question, which is, for those thinking about starting their own PB process, right? Or they're kind of the first cycle in a longer process. Kind of what do you recommend, in terms of, I think we were talking about kind of writing of the rules. Does it make sense to kind of make it, I guess, what is the balance of how much do you want to, especially for first time implementers, how do you want to, how much kind of flexibility and yeah, how much structure do you want to provide to those thinking about starting their first PB process, or is there a kind of a standard model or a starter model that they can think about implementing? And what are the pros and cons of that approach? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's funny. My wife works in public health, and she's working for a local medical group, and she's going to get vaccinated for COVID as a result. But her father's also like an infectious disease specialist, so she goes to the doctor at the medical group, and she goes, "Well, which vaccine should I wait for the better one? What's the best one?" And he's like, "The best one's the one that's available right now. That's the best vaccine always." So in terms of what advice I would give, I'd say if you're really enthusiastic about PB, figure out how you can get it rolling. What are some possible avenues? That's the thing about anything that's process oriented, right? You're not interested. The product is the process, right? Paradise is not a place, it's an ongoing project. And so if you can get the process going and have the features that allow it to self-regulate, then that's a success, most likely, hopefully. I don't know if Thea would agree or.
I agree. I mean, I think some of the kind of going off of that, any process is going to, you're going to need a degree of flexibility, and you're also going to have to become comfortable with uncertainty, which I think is challenging for a lot of people. And it, in a first year, and the first time anyone's ever done PB, I think that can be some of the most challenging pieces for um, folks, right? Because we all want to make sure something is successful, but like, what does that mean? And I think, kind of to Drew's point, if what we're trying to do is start something, setting your expectations with, we're learning, and we're going to we're going to set an environment where we're going to learn as we go. And so we know that we're going to do the best that we can to make this as good as we can. But we also know that we're going to have to continually improve it. So even after you've done it for multiple years and better and better each year, there's still going to have to be room for improvement because nothing is static. Everything is in constant flux and change in communities and in government. And so you're always going to have to be adapting and changing, both in terms of maybe the rules that govern the pot of money, the budgets that overall that will be changing in terms of local government and the context in which those budgets are operating. You know, I mean, just look at what's happened this past year. Nobody expected, what's happened in terms of how COVID has impacted, all systems in terms of, local government, and how it's operated, how it's impacted everything in terms of our daily lives. Right. I mean, that's a pretty extreme case, but I think those of us who've worked both in community and in local government know that things shift and change a lot. And you have to be able to grow and change with that. And I think the other piece that I would say is knowing that there are communities that are harder to reach, and that a big goal for me has always been making sure that you want those communities not just involved, but you want them to feel that they have a safe space to be able to be engaged. When you're designing your PD process, you want to make sure that there are people who are their advocates who work with them in their communities, who are working with you to design the process, who are on the steering committee, who can help reach out to those communities, who can raise issues, who can think about things from the perspective of all of those different communities, so that you're still not going to catch everything, but you're going to be thinking about those things from the beginning and helping to build that into your process as much as possible. Does there need to be like in some of our wards, they have a separate Spanish language committee, because that is what helped folks who predominantly speak Spanish feel safe and feel comfortable participating in PV. We had some spaces where there was dual language, where there was, translation happening, but we noticed that they still weren't participating in the same way as they were when they had their own committee that was fully Spanish speaking. So then that's the direction that we went to move in. So you try to adapt and change and listen to people in the community so that you're setting spaces up in ways that are comfortable for them. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah. In fact, we've gotten a few questions now about inclusivity, and I should note that this is something that we over at Citizen Lab deal with all the time, which is, every city we talk to, there's a question of inclusivity and making sure that, we're kind of hearing from all the different communities within a city or within a certain region. And as such, we're actually putting together an inclusion guide that we can send out with, I think, after this webinar as well. But I want to dig in a little bit more there. So yeah, can you talk a bit about, I think maybe the steering committee, right? I think maybe that's a good starting point. I guess, who are the type of, how are you recruiting for these roles? How do you kind of make sure, is it kind of just a gut feeling? Like, how do you know you're kind of being as inclusive as possible?
I don't know that you're ever being as inclusive as possible. I mean, Drew.
I kind of maybe put the brakes for a second, because I think it's important to underscore this. If you want to be inclusive and be good at it, do it again and again and again, right? You're not going to nail it first. It's not going to be an and one, and in one, we got it, just one take. And so I think what Thea was saying, and that's important, is you want to bring people to the table at the beginning that you know or suspect will help with the process of inclusion. And that will be the step that you needed to get a better insight into it, right? Just like you ask someone from a neighborhood about the neighborhood, and you meet other people from the neighborhood as a result of their response. And those people tell you more about the neighborhood. Those populations that you want to make sure get involved, you have to take one, maybe 3 steps at a time, but you get better as more people become comfortable, more people develop capacity. Or as Thea was saying, like some wards have Spanish language committees. How would you know how to do that at the beginning? You know, the ward obviously was trying to do translation. They had thought of, okay, how do we help Spanish speakers participate? But only after at least one cycle did they realize, oh, this would do a better job of what we were trying to accomplish. So don't be scared away by the fact that you didn't have the answer when you started.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just to I know I'll let you jump in a second, but I think also it's good to remember that, you know, the PB, it happens in cycles, right? And so it's really, as we think about this and as we talk about this, it's not just a 1-year commitment or a 1-year project, but really you're thinking long-term, and you're thinking about how do you create something that grows and improves over time. And so I thought, Drew, that was a really good point. Taya, sorry, did I cut you
No,
off?
absolutely, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. I think there was 2 points there that I want to just highlight. One is that being not just open to, but welcoming of the fact that you're not going to have all the answers, that the people around you are the ones who are going to have a lot of the answers, and engaging them the same way that you engage folks in the PB process in okay, how do we problem solve this? And knowing that sometimes you have to experiment to get it right. And sometimes that means that you're going to make mistakes, and not being afraid to try something and perhaps fail. In one of our first years, we partnered and gave contracts to community organizing groups, and we had them using census data door knock to engage some of the harder to reach populations and make sure that we were doing really targeted outreach. Well, what we learned was that the census data wasn't keeping up with people moving. And so we were door knocking in an area that had quickly transformed, and we weren't actually reaching the population we needed to reach. And so we had to pivot and figure out how to reach out in another way, and use those resources to instead try to do some phone banking, and also to physically go to some different places in the community. And so we started doing what we call pop-up voting, where we bring PB to the people. And so we would do voting at transit stations. We experimented a lot. We did voting at grocery stores. We did voting at pretty much any place we could, to try to figure out, you know, because sometimes it's not always the traditional places that you think. So where is it that we can reach people and start talking to them about PB, because they may not know about it, and help bring them in so that maybe they participate next year. Who are the community leaders? How do we, you know, identify them beyond just the, you know, this is the ED of that organization? You know, who are some of the other on the ground leaders in the neighborhood who run the block clubs? You know, it's a lot of groundwork, but you know, it's worth it. And then one of the other things that one of our wards and community residents developed was an equity matrix tool, because I saw one of the questions in here about how do you ensure equity. Sometimes, you know, with projects and with democracy, people voting, they haven't been engaged or involved as long as the people who are developing the projects, and they've done all this research, and they know what parts of the community or the ward. In Chicago, a ward has slices and pieces of many different neighborhoods, and Chicago is a very neighborhood focused city. And so they might not know the ward they live in, but they know their neighborhood. And so when the people who haven't participated the same length of time as the people who developed the proposals, they'd go out and vote thinking, well, that's in my neighborhood. right? And so you weren't always seeing in the first year a reallocation of resources based on equity, because in some of those same neighborhoods, they were the harder to reach populations to get them out to vote. So what we started to do was to pair projects together by issue area. So we would have 2 park projects on the ballot together, or 2 lighting projects together, so that in an area that may be, whiter and more affluent and turns more people out to vote, it was paired with a park project in an area that was less affluent and was more low income, so that we made sure that the resources were getting into the areas of greater need. But one of our residents came up with that.
I love that. I think that's a great idea. So we've got about a little over 10 minutes left, and I want to save some time for questions. We've got a few here. So if anyone who hasn't asked a question yet and you have one, now's a good time to do so. So I want to get to them in kind of the order, see what we haven't discussed so far. So someone asked about, and it's kind of related to what we were talking about, but how does one protect minority voices and interests within PB? Do you have any thoughts on, have you seen that in practice? Thea, Drew?
So there are some structural ways you can do it, depending on how sort of formal and structured deliberation, like idea collection spaces, the proposal expos are. You can actually allocate minutes, floor minutes to people based on identity if you want, or zip code, or height, if that seems like an equity measure that's important to you. You can build in those things. You can say that, just like Thea was mentioning, by pairing projects so that funds are being distributed equitably. There are many things that could work depending on your context, and so you try them out. I also think that establishing a goal, establishing a principle, like an underlying principle of, equity, power building, power sharing, those principles that begin a steering committee deliberation on the rule book are important. And they allow you to come back later, as in the case that I mentioned. I don't know that we could have changed voter eligibility, had a different voter eligibility at the beginning, but we were able to come back to it later in the process when it came up, and everybody was like, yeah, let's change it. No question. So those founding principles matter. What has worked for Chicago in that regard? Thea, like, what do you think has been the most, or at least one of the most like overtly structural features that is built in?
I would say a couple things have been most effective. One is the one piece I've been talking about, which is the equity ballot, and that has been probably one of the most successful at making sure resources are allocated most equitably. And that was the piece I was talking about with pairing of projects. In addition to that, the fact that our goals are specifically about equity, inclusion, community and coalition building, and sustainability, we frequently have that be a piece that, as people are developing their projects and making decisions about which final projects go on the ballot, they have to refer back to that and think about how those projects are really achieving those goals, or are they more looking at something that's more personal? How are they discussing that? I think this year, I'm trying to push the envelope a little further and also set some benchmarks around outreach in terms of, what kinds of targets, priority targets that they can set around that for the vote, as well as for idea collection.
Great. So I want to, there's two more questions I want to get to before we wrap up. So one has to do with kind of how do you evaluate a project, and thinking about, you know, how should we kind of define success or think of success? Maybe especially if this is year 1 or 2 of a PB cycle. So, you know, is there a way to tell, like, what is a good number of percentage of eligible residents who vote on PB? Like, is there a certain number that, you know, we'd feel good about hitting, right? So, yeah, so thinking about how do you define success? And then the second has to do with kind of running into what kind of challenges you've seen, particularly at the city level. You know, if you're seeing challenges from elected officials, in the sense that, you know, that would maybe kind of dilute their authority. And then if you're seeing challenges around the idea that, I think there are a lot of people who may think that residents don't really want to be involved in the process as much, that it's too much work and they don't have time, and they'd rather just kind of a politician tell them something and then deliver it later. So maybe one of you take each of these questions. Drew, maybe you take the I don't know, you guys decide how you want to answer, but one is, how do you evaluate success, and what is a kind of a good PB look like? And the second is, how do you deal with opposition within a government from political and from kind of other stakeholders? Who wants to go first?
I'll take the political question first. So absolutely, you will hear inside of both government as well as, I think, city managers, resistance to PB. I think that there's a lot of reasons why people choose to do PB or choose not to do PB. In today's climate, I think that we can also say there's a lot of reasons to do PB, right? One is there's an increasing polarization, and how do we think about where that polarization is coming from and what it's creating, right? There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation about how government works. And there's a lot of distrust, both on the sides of residents not trusting government, and government also, I think, sometimes not trusting residents, right? In some of what I see you're writing, that, you know, voters don't want to be involved. I've also heard a lot of comments where, you know, they think voters are going to make strange suggestions or won't take it seriously, or may use the money in ways that are not the highest priority, you know, that technocrats would be better at making those decisions. But I think that what we've seen both in research from public administration as well as coming out of democracy and civics is that there's a lot of reason to do participation. Public administration research has shown that that you don't have to pit democracy against efficiency and effectiveness. That in fact, particularly around using the case of transportation funds, there was some research that showed participation actually decreased traffic fatalities because of the educational benefits that Drew and I have talked about. When people are engaged and involved, they learn how government works. They learn why certain decisions are made. In a lot of cases, they also help public officials have political will to make certain tough decisions, either about raising taxes or about having to make trade-offs about really difficult certain public services and not other public services, depending upon the pot of money. So there's a lot of really good reasons for why you would want to engage with residents, and it's not it's not always about, you know, I mean, it is slower. It does take time, but I think those educational benefits and the rebuilding of trust between government, especially right now, are really critical. And so those are some of the things that I would point to in terms of why to do this. I don't know if that helps answer that question.
I thought it was a great answer, and I think you know, your answer kind of bring it back to schools, right? The answer is, you know, do people want to be involved? Do they, will they vote will they kind of take it seriously, or will they vote for a big water slide or something, and I think time and time again, we've seen that, yes, they will take it seriously. And by participating in the process, it doesn't even, we haven't even talked about the fact that you don't need $1 million in the pot to do it, right? That it's actually just the process. And by bringing people into that process, that that you're going to build trust and kind of help them strengthen those like civic muscles, that I think for a lot of us have atrophied in recent years. So I know we're almost at time. I want to get to the last question, Drew. This is a good place to wrap it up. Kind of what, do you want to talk about kind of how do you define success, and kind of are there any kind of heuristics we can use to determine whether it's been successful, whether we've kind of reached a broader community in terms of participation, in terms of outcomes? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, one thing that's always nice is you can never prove anything, right? You can only prove that you didn't do it. So I think I just want to build on something Thea said that's important. When people engage in PB, they begin to realize that maybe they can have the water slide, but if they get the water slide, they can't have as many ambulances. They can't have as many like reduced or free childcare centers in the neighborhood. And so then they stop wanting the water slide. And that has been shown in the research again and again, that people make more selfless choices from participating in PB. They actually choose projects other than the ones they were originally excited about. And they understand why they can't necessarily have what they want, or why what they want isn't what the community needs. They get that. As far as like, trying to measure success, so were more people involved, how, like, did we reach our goal of participation? So on a very decontextualized model, okay, how many people participated in the last federal election, city election, state election, midterm election? I would look at all of those. What are the demographics of those people? And then I would say, okay, where are they concentrated in terms of neighborhoods? Do we see a general increase in quantity? Then I would also look at, okay, we had this kind of attendance at each sort of event related to the PB cycle. Was it the same people? Did they come more than once? How many people arose to develop proposals, right? So if you have 50 proposals from a neighborhood, that's pretty good. And then I also think that success has to be measured in a number of ways. And one thing that's really awesome about PB is for those people that really aren't interested in talking about the details of something, they can still participate, right? There are different levels of participation, and you'll see some of the most like profound transformation maybe at the level of people that are developing proposals or that end up on a steering committee. But even if you just want a new stop sign, you can go and vote for the new stop sign, and that's it. Like, that's all you got to do. You don't have to sit through a lot of meetings, so it's possible. Success can be measured qualitatively and quantitatively, and that's something to really talk about in depth at the beginning. Okay, this is our goal. How do we know if we achieved it, or what might we look at, and how do we build in pieces to the process that allow us to do a temperature check? Do we want to modify as we're going through the process? So if we see the participation isn't what we want based on our ongoing analysis, do we want to try and tweak the process to improve it? Did we learn something in the middle? I don't know if that, and I well, there's one other thing. So I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but what I think makes a successful PB process is rooted in my values and my commitment to PB as a tool. But ultimately, when I am working for someone, my clients' goals are the ones that I'm trying to reach. I have no doubts that many of my own goals, even if they're not explicitly shared by my client, can be achieved at the same time. But I think the goals of someone like me versus a city manager, or someone that's the member of like a, that's leading a community group or some civil society organization, there'll be different motivations and they'll have different goals. But there's a place at the table for all of those goals.
Yeah, and I think that's a good note to wrap up on. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I know we're a little bit over. Special thanks to Thea and Drew for taking the time today to chat with us and share your expertise. We will send out a, if anyone attending wants to reach out to Thea and Drew, we will share maybe their emails or put together some sort of, we'll share their emails with you all, and if you have questions for them. And we'll also send out a recording of this as well as that guide I mentioned on inclusivity. Anyway, well, thank you so much for joining us here today, and hope to see you all around, and maybe next time we do this. All right, Thea, Drew, any last things, or should we wrap?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you later.